Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on some of America's most foundational stories. We're going to peel back the layers of legend to get to the raw, unfiltered, and, yeah, often uncomfortable truths that lie underneath.
Okay, let's just dive right in with a story that I bet most of us heard as kids. You know the one. It's a tale that's been used to define a president's entire character for generations.
That's right. The story of George Washington and the cherry tree? Totally made up. It was a complete fabrication, invented by his biographer, a guy named Mason Locke Weems. And he didn't even add it until the 5th edition of his book, years after Washington was gone. His goal wasn't really about documenting history. It was about creating a squeaky clean hero for a new nation, and, let's be honest, to sell more books. The irony is just staggering, isn't it? The most famous story about honesty is itself a lie.
But that little piece of fiction, that cherry tree story, it actually opens the door to a much bigger, much more real story. Not just about Washington, but about all of America's founders. See, these weren't simple heroes from some fable. They were deeply complex people, and they were absolutely wrestling with some huge contradictions.
And here's the paradox. While the cherry tree story is a myth, it kind of accidentally points to a real truth. Washington himself, in his own words, cared deeply about his reputation for honesty. He believed it was the most enviable of all titles. It was a huge part of his public identity and, really, his power as a leader.
And this is where that ideal of honesty just collides head-on with the central, unavoidable contradiction of his life. Because this man, the great champion of liberty, was also a lifelong slave owner. That number, 317, that's the number of enslaved people living on his estate, Mount Vernon, at the time he died.
And this timeline shows you just how complicated that struggle was. If you read his private letters from the 1780s, you can see he was coming to believe that slavery was wrong. But his public actions were, well, different. When he was president in Philadelphia, he literally used legal loopholes to rotate the people he enslaved back to Virginia. Why? To keep them from claiming their freedom under Pennsylvania law. And even his will, which did free the people he personally owned, came with a catch. It would only happen after his wife, Martha, died. And it still tore families apart, since many were married to other enslaved people he couldn't legally free.
This complexity wasn't limited to slavery either. I mean, depending on who you were, Washington's legacy looks completely different. To the Iroquois people, whose villages he ordered destroyed during the Revolution, he wasn't the father of his country. To them, he was Conotochirius, which means town destroyer. It's a name that really captures the brutal reality of Western expansion from a whole different point of view.
And this pattern of contradiction, these celebrated ideals clashing with some very harsh realities, it didn't end with the founders, not at all. As the nation grew, the legends of other figures, like Abraham Lincoln and the famous explorers Lewis and Clark, they became just as complicated.
We all know Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, right? But if you look at his own words, his primary, #1 goal was always political: preserving the Union. He said it himself very plainly in an 1862 letter. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it.
So this shows us that even his most famous actions were also incredibly strategic calculations. The Emancipation Proclamation, it was a brilliant war measure. That's why it specifically didn't apply to the border states that stayed loyal to the Union. This is also the president who suspended habeas corpus, that's the right to challenge your own detention, for about 15,000 civilians. And for much of his life, he actually supported the idea of colonization, the belief that freed black people should be encouraged to leave the country.
This kind of hidden complexity isn't just about presidents either. It's woven right into the story of American exploration itself. We're taught to see the Lewis and Clark expedition as this grand journey of scientific discovery, but that was really only half the story.
If you dig into President Jefferson's secret instructions to them, you see it was less a scientific journey and more of a thinly veiled military and economic mission. The real goal was to assert U.S. dominance over all that new Louisiana territory and to pave the way for American settlement, a move that would, of course, have devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples already living there. And nowhere does this contradiction become more personal, more human, than in the story of one specific member of that expedition. This is York. He was an enslaved man owned by William Clark, and he became an absolutely crucial member of the team.
So out there on the trail, York experienced a level of freedom and respect he'd never known. He was vital in diplomatic meetings with native tribes, but when they got back to St. Louis, that promise of a new life, it just evaporated. Clark denied him his freedom for years, and when York demanded it, he was beaten. It's just a profound betrayal of everything they had been through together.
So what do we do with this stuff? With all these uncomfortable truths about the legends we cherish? How are we supposed to read our own history when the line between a hero and, well, something much more complicated starts to get really blurry?
Well, the sources suggest one way to look at it is to see American history as a clash between two completely different kinds of journeys. One was a journey for survival. The other was a journey for profit and plunder.
This kind of reframes the entire narrative, doesn't it? The Ice Bridge journey refers to the first people who came to the Americas across the Bering Land Bridge. It's an acknowledgement of the thousands of years of rich, complex history that was already here long before Columbus arrived, beginning that second journey, the one that was motivated by conquest and exploitation.
So what's the big takeaway here? Acknowledging these uncomfortable facts doesn't erase history, it just makes it more human. Our heroes were flawed people, they were products of their time, and embracing this atomic truth, the raw, unfiltered, and often contradictory reality at the core of these stories, that's what actually allows for a deeper, more profound appreciation of our past. It helps us understand the contradictions in our nation's history, and maybe even the contradictions inside ourselves.
And that leaves us with one last thought. If the neat, clean stories we've been told are incomplete, what does that mean for us? It means we have to become more active readers of our own past. It means we have to ask tougher questions, seek out the perspectives that were swept under the rug, and, in the end, find a more profound, more honest story in the process.